Well, given that other Middle Eastern countries Iraq has attacked who seem to be totally innocent in this matter, you could think that, but perhaps not.
The Iranian regime administration has not been funding international global terrorism around the world. Well, what I'd say is New Zealand has long supported actions to prevent Israel from getting access to a nuclear weapon. New Zealand has long supported actions to make sure that Iran doesn't repress and kill its own people. This is an evil regime.
Would we support carpet bombing the country?
Well, I mean, we obviously understand. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that we understand this. I don't know how to be any clearer, guys. I mean,
Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and Foreign Minister Winston Peters have responded to the war against Iran in the vilest way possible. While ordinary people understand that it is reprehensible and completely invalid to blame the victim for being attacked, they have gone ahead and done so anyway. They have made themselves look both immoral and foolish. They are not winning any friends, but they are clearly answering to the people they serve and, spoiler alert, they don't serve the voters of Aotearoa. Their slips of tongue are very revealing. By saying Iraq instead of Iran, Peters is actually showing that his head is where it's meant to be at. Yes, he named the wrong country and looks like a buffoon, but his tone is precisely correct. The very point of this government's response is to brush aside questions of legality and morality and base our diplomatic response on calling Iranians the baddies and thus blunting the antagonism of the people towards the US for committing the supreme war crime of waging a war of aggression. It is small wonder that Peter's brain has reverted to the designated enemy from a prior time, because these claims are by nature interchangeable. Luxon's repeated gaffes, by contrast, are betraying a considerable difficulty he is having in wrapping his head around this one. Every person is capable of being stupid, and we all have areas of critical weakness. Politicians are often immensely stupid about really important things, which generally derives from their arrogance. But these stupid politicians are almost always as cunning as foxes when it comes to their own interests. Luxon, however, is an all-rounder of idiocy. Few politicians rise very far while being so reliable in their dim-wittedness. Liz Truss springs to mind. Like Truss, one can only assume that Luxon has led a life in which pedestrian mediocrity is overpraised as being proof that he is a special little girl, or maybe boy in his instance. He has been groomed for political power because he is a tool in both senses of the word. Coddled in a Disney life where CEOs are the smartest, bestest, bravest, nicest guys around, Luxon's Pollyanna-ish worldview makes Jacinda Ardern look like Otto von Bismarck. The problem for Luxon is that he has never realised that it's all a lie. He still thinks that once people get to know him, they will realise he is a really nice, smart guy who knows what's best for everyone. In his mind, he is the firm but fair paterfamilias of Aotearoa, and he is loyal to his country, totally loyal. His country is the United States of America. He thinks we are a subsidiary. We are a franchise in the McFeudal system, and he knows that though he has risen high in the great chain of being, the top rung is occupied by God, and next down, just above Jesus and Elon Musk, is the almighty President of the United States. The episodes of cognitive dissonance that Luxon falls prey to have been coming ever more frequently and intensely, as if these were the agonies of birthing a grown-up version of himself. His stumblings, his frustrations, his Freudian use of the word Iran when he meant to say Ukraine, and soon twice after using Israel for Iran, show that in his atrophied centres of logic and reason, something does not add up for him. Polls show that Luxon's hindbrain is not alone. The Western public may be awash in a powerful mixture of manufactured fear, chauvinistic self-righteousness, racism and Islamophobia, Yet people are still having trouble digesting this latest holy crusade. At least for now, there is an air of "are we the baddies" having over our feckless ruling class. In the US, public support for the attack is at only 20 or 27% according to different polls. In the UK, the figures are similar. In both the US and the UK, the far right, MAGA and Reform respectively, are split on their support for the war. Meanwhile, the world's leaders are doing their best to compete in the lick-spittle Olympics. Here, the wonderful Lucas Fabraro summarises.
In keeping with tradition, the US and Israel kicked things off by bombing dozens of children. Now, in a world that wasn't run by incompetent, amoral amoebas, this would be the part where universal condemnation would follow. We do not live in such a world, so this is what the amoebas gave us. France, Germany, and the UK condemned Iran for retaliating and called on Iran to seek a negotiated solution. You know, the thing they had been doing for weeks before they got bombed. Never to be outdone in ridiculousness, the European Union called Iran's attacks unjustified and announced they were convening a security meeting for 2 days later on Monday. No rush, I guess. The weather's nice. The Australian Prime Minister endorsed the illegal US-Israeli attacks, as did the Canadian Prime Minister barely a month after he was celebrated around the world for a speech urging countries to unite against a US-run world order where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
This is peak fascism. In many ways, there may be no coming back from this. These people no longer care about the facade of legitimacy, and they are all vicious sociopaths. The common theme here is that they're all trying to tell us to ignore our lying eyes and ears and to understand that the villains are the Iranians. The US and Israel are the heroes. They heroically start wars. They heroically murder 168 primary school girls. They heroically commit genocide. And the evil Iranians and Palestinians viciously attack them in response. Their actions are bad because they are the bad guys. Our actions are good because we are the good guys. In order to actually have some clarity about these things and to avoid the subjectivity of moral judgments of who is the biggest baddie and whether we like people like the recently deceased Ayatollah Khamenei or not, we should use the lens of international law to understand these things. Not because the law is perfect, but because it can be applied evenly to all sides, and that is a clarifying matter. Under international law, you cannot simply attack people because you don't like what they're doing. The New Zealand government chose to publish its weaselly hypocrisy in a statement that will stain our country for posterity. This is how Winston Peters and Christopher Luxon chose to commit our response in writing to the attack on Iran. It begins, New Zealand has consistently condemned Iran's nuclear program. That is the opening phrase. For an event in which Israel and the US started bombing and shooting missiles at another country. That is the way they want to frame it. The fact that they have consistently condemned Iran's nuclear program. Well, on what grounds do they condemn that program? The fact is, Iran has the right to enrich uranium. It does so as a compliant signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It could withdraw from that treaty if it chose to, perfectly legally. It has that right, and if it chose to build nuclear weapons, that is also its legal right, once it is withdrawn from that treaty. But instead, it has remained in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It made a nuclear deal with the US.
This is a regime that's been pursuing a nuclear weapons program despite endless rounds of diplomacy, breaking international laws.
It was the US that broke that deal. So why the fuck is our government condemning Iran because of its nuclear program? The statement goes on, talking about Iran's destabilizing activities in the region and elsewhere. Compared to whom? Have they invaded their neighbours? No, they haven't. Have they gone to the other side of the world and invaded? No, they haven't. The US has invaded Iraq. The US destabilized and overthrew Iran's government and instituted a brutal puppet monarchy. When there was a revolution in Iran, it deceived neighbouring Iraq into attacking and then armed both sides in a brutal 8-year war with some elected officials in the US eventually saying aloud that they wanted both sides to destroy each other. The US has supported and funded separatist movements, including terrorist organizations who carried out bombing attacks against civilians. Israel has gone to war with all of its neighbours, invading Lebanon, Syria and Egypt. It supports terror organisations. Israel has conducted a massive indiscriminate terror attack in Lebanon using devices such as pagers and phones, and then boasted about it, proving that they are clever and powerful people. The US and Israel both conduct covert operations against supposedly friendly countries and explicit destabilisation operations against its enemies. Murdering enemy leaders and, most saliently, peace negotiators has become a matter of routine for both countries. So how do we then justify condemning Iran's destabilisation? How can one point to individual acts and claim that Iran is behind them, but the scale of US and Israeli destabilisation is orders of magnitude beyond Iran's? Once again, it seems that the real crime is to be the victim. That is the logic of our government. Our government statement then goes on to add the last thing that it condemns: Iran's repression of its own people. And by what right do we point the finger at others in that sense? It's not unreasonable for governments to express concern and even condemnation of other governments' treatment of their own people. But in these circumstances, when the world's preeminent military power has attacked a poor country, it seems pretty bizarre to begin with this list of condemnations, including the repression of its own people. The statement continues, quote, Iran has for decades defied the will and expectations of the international community. The international community here means the US and the people who side with them. Usually the people whom it has some hold over. Let's be quite clear about that. The purpose of our government in taking the stance it takes is to stop us from being punished by the US for being disobedient. We gain nothing from this as a country. We lose a lot by siding with this dying empire, who is an aggressor in this case. Anyway, this statement continues, quote, the legitimacy of a government rests on the support of its people. The Iranian regime has long since lost that support. In this context, we acknowledge that the actions taken by the US and Israel were designed to prevent Iran from continuing to threaten international peace and security. What a crock of shit. Firstly, clearly, the argument can be made that these attacks threaten international peace and security. In fact, they shatter international peace and security. And Iran has said again and again and again that if you attack us this time, we are going to strike back as hard as we can, because they have been attacked previously. In fact, it's less than a year since they were last attacked on a very large scale. They have little choice in this. They are having their deterrence ability degraded again and again and again. So, of course, they need to strike back as hard as possible. So, the recent negotiations being conducted under the auspices of Oman, and the Omani foreign minister revealed that Iran was actually willing to give up its nuclear enrichment, and he flew straight to the US to announce this publicly. He bypassed the US negotiators in order to go straight to the US public, because obviously the logic was that they thought it was the only way to derail the impending war.
First, we had the genocidal US-Israel duo start a war with Iran just hours after it was reported that substantial progress had been made towards a deal to avert this, with the mediator of the talks saying a peace deal is within our reach. That peace was probably what this so-called preventive war was intended to prevent.
So it seems clear that the US launched the war sooner than they had wished in response to this threat of impending peace. I assume that a pretext was planned, but it was dependent on future developments. That is the only explanation for the bizarre array of justifications given so far. The US claimed it was acting preemptively, and then it claimed it was waging a preventive war. And then Marco Rubio came up with a rather exotic claim for preemption, saying that Israel was about to attack Iran, and the US knew that Iran was going to retaliate against the US for Israel's attack. It's a ridiculous and silly claim on many levels, but Rubio was actually trying to create a legal veneer. Other US politicians are so drunk on power and chauvinist fervour that they reacted very badly to someone suggesting that Israel had forced the US's hand. Like the dangerous fascist idiots they are, they scrambled instead to explain that they are all war criminals. Trump insisted that it was he who made Israel go to war, and a consensus has formed around saying that they attacked Iran because it was weak at the moment. Just to add to the madness, others have suggested that the US was preempting an Iranian preemption, which is in fact another admission of an intent to wage a war of aggression. Some people have cited the threat from Iran's nuclear program, which Trump claimed to have obliterated 7 months ago, but to add to his absolute panoply of madness, Ted Cruz claims that they attacked because Iran's nuclear program is destroyed, which meant it was a good time to attack. The optics of saying you're attacking someone because they're weak doesn't seem to bother the Epstein-class rulers of the most military powerful nation in the history of the world. They have effectively circled back to the notion of preventive war, but preventive war is explicitly illegal. So preemptive war is when someone's about to attack you and you attack their military assets in order to prevent that attack from, or weaken their attack, or prevent the attack from happening. Preventive war is going to war against someone because you think they might get stronger in the future, rather like punching a 5-year-old in the head in case they grow up to be a big person who could beat you up. It's totally illegal. It's explicitly considered illegal. So we have to look at the US reasons for doing this. I mean, Iran could have legitimately done a preemptive strike against the US. Not that they would, because they would then make an excuse for the US attacking them, but they legitimately could, because the US was creating a big military build-up and saying that they were going to start attacking Iran. So Iran did actually have a reason for a case for striking preemptively. However, the reasons for attacking Iran can't even be considered defensive. So you're talking about two nuclear-armed powers, one of which is the most powerful, militarily powerful country in the history of the world, and their immediate reason for attacking Iran must have been to prevent them from developing a deterrent through their missile program. The real issue was that Iran wouldn't be subjugated, and US actions in this are a continuation of their genocidal hybrid warfare. People are going on about how Netanyahu has wanted for decades to attack Iran, but I'm old enough to remember the way Supreme Leader Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who died in 1989, was built up as the great villain and the enemy of America. And the US has made no secret of its desire to attack Iran for longer than Netanyahu. So I don't understand why we have to cite Netanyahu's desires there. I mean, John McCain about 20 years ago went on TV and sang bomb, 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 bomb Iran, bomb, 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 bomb Iran. In the early 2000s, there was a saying among neocons which was real men go to Tehran, saying that Iraq wasn't enough. They needed to go into Iran as well, and that is really like a continuation of their dual containment policy from the 1980s. Again, all of this predating any such talk from Israeli leaders. The point of their attack is to continue their basically genocidal hybrid warfare. Now, I call it genocidal because it's aimed at the people rather than the regime. It's aimed at weakening the country. If the regime was replaced tomorrow, they would still want to be at war with them, because Iran is an oil-rich, very large nation with 92 million people in it, with other minerals as well. It's a natural enemy of their ability to dominate Middle Eastern oil. So the nature of their attacks betray the fact that they were intending to enrage people as well. Among the first strikes on the first day were the ones that killed Ali Khamenei. You can characterize that as decapitation, but the man was 87 years old. His significance at that age is that he is a religious leader more than probably a political power. He's certainly, his removal from the system is hardly going to change the political functioning of Iran. In contrast, though, he is a religious leader for tens of millions of Shia, almost the equivalent of the Pope, and they killed him in Ramadan, the holy month of Islam, which has enraged not just Shia but other Muslims around the world. And I don't think that is unintentional. I don't think that's an accidental byproduct. And another thing that they did was conduct an attack against a girls' primary school. This, we now know, was a double strike attack. So they bombed the school. Then when the principal gathered all the school kids in their prayer room and contacted parents to come and pick up their kids, then they conducted a second strike, also killing 2 first responders and one of the parents who'd reached there by that stage. They clearly wanted to maximise the number of schoolgirls they'd killed. This place had once been a part of a barracks for the IRGC's naval, for their navy, but it had long since stopped being so. 10 years ago, and a navy barracks is hardly a top target anyway, in any sense. So they clearly intended to do this, and I think this is to enrage people. And the same with the so-called decapitations. They are intended to create chaos, to make it difficult for people to negotiate a peaceful solution to this, to provoke people into taking actions that can then be used to justify further killing against Iranians. This is the nature of what the US does. It tries to sow chaos and spread conflict as far and wide as possible, because that is where its strategic advantage lies. It lies in having the weapons and the technology of warfare. Iran has long sought to find ways of deterring these sorts of attacks against it, and I think the underlying reason that Iran was doing nuclear enrichment beyond what is necessary for nuclear power plants has been in order to give themselves a bargaining chip, in the fallacious belief that the US and Israel actually cared about its potential for a nuclear weapons program. I think in this they played into the US's hands, because it was always there for the US to use as an excuse to attack them. Iran, of course, it has uranium of its own. It might have seemed a logical thing to try and use that as a bargaining chip, but I think it was sadly mistaken. The US and Israel don't care about that. What they want to destroy is Iran's strategic and economic power, because it has these oil and mineral resources and the population and the territory to be a regional hegemon and to establish independence from the US and Israel. And if it used its military spending to build a missile system that gave them an asymmetric ability to fight back against much more expensive and powerful US and Israeli assets that gives them a deterrent. So, of course, this all means that everything they do can be characterized as being, admittedly in bad faith, as being a threat to international peace and security. But our Western media, of course, do act in bad faith. They have no interest in trying to actually analyse things. They are basically, from pundits to journalists to editors to publishers, the whole lot are really in on this horrible genocidal program. So, and we get to the insane point to where they're saying that you can prevent a threat to international peace and security by destroying international peace and security. And of course it happens here as well. Our own government's sick jokes continue in their statement. They say, we condemn in the strongest terms Iran's indiscriminate retaliatory attacks on Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain and Jordan. These countries all host US military assets that are being used to attack Iran. Iran has mostly been targeting things like radar installations and US bases. And there is something peculiar and Orwellian about the implication that the condemnation of retaliatory attacks, they're condemning retaliatory attacks with somehow blanking out what the retaliation is from. I mean, is Iran not allowed to retaliate when attacked? They're almost reached the point where they're simply saying out loud that the crime is to fight back. Each one of the nations that Iran's attacking is hosting and colluding with the military infrastructure used to attack Iran. That means that they are legitimate military targets. Iran has also attacked some civilian targets, including airports and hotels. If they were the US or Israel, then no one would even mention these attacks because, they haven't caused casualties or high casualties. They would be seen as just not even a news story. Even if we look beyond this double standard, though, and indulge this idea that the victim of a war of aggression has to be held to a higher standard than the attacker, Iran still has a perfectly reasonable legal defense for its actions. In that it would contradict basic natural justice to give them a right to defend themselves, which they have under the UN Charter, but say that they can't use the defences that they actually have. The same thing applies, for example, to rockets fired from Gaza. They might, in other circumstances, be considered illegal due to their inability to be used with discrimination. But given the circumstances, to treat them as illegal is, by its nature, a negation of their right to armed self-defence and their right to armed resistance to occupation. So, Iran has neighbours who would face retaliatory consequences from the US if they didn't provide support for its aggression. So, if Bahrain threw out the US Fifth Fleet, Bahrain would pay a huge price. We know this. I mean, you'd have to be stupid to think that that's not the case. Some of these countries are very critical. Qatar also hosts CENTCOM, the command and control infrastructure for the region for the US. Iran doesn't want to wage outright war with those neighbours, which clearly it doesn't, and they don't want to wage war with it. So Iran has to find a way of countering the US hold over them. So Iran has been signalling for months now, trying to get the Gulf nations to take a stand against US aggression against Iran. So now they're showing these countries that there is a price to pay. And the obvious centre of gravity in places like Dubai and Doha is the soft power and the economic power of these countries. So they have spent a lot creating soft power, getting their name around in the West, and Saudi Arabia, of course, has done a bit of this as well. And the tourism destinations, massive transport hubs for civilian travel, business and tourism. Attacking these assets, on the face of it, is illegal, but if it's the only realistic way that Iran can exercise self-defense against aggressors, and they are aggressors, whether they want to be or not, they are partaking in as belligerents in an aggression by hosting these military assets on their soil. So it would be difficult to say that, I mean, at least Iran has a pretty good defence against accusations that they're committing a war crime here, and they have kept these strikes very limited. They've only done enough to achieve the disruptions to travel and the sense of security needed to achieve their ends. If you did consider these things to be illegal under war crimes laws, these attacks to be illegal under the Geneva Convention, say, then that would be overriding their rights under the UN Charter. So I think that the Geneva Conventions in this case have to take a second place to the UN Charter in that. And this isn't just some exotic legal theory made up by a non-lawyer here, but it's actually fundamental to the way the Nuremberg trials and the UN Charter sort of advanced international law after World War II. For a combination of reasons that were both pragmatic and principled, yet also self-serving, the victors from World War II were very careful to emphasise the culpability of the aggressor in all of the things that happened in World War II. The Nuremberg Tribunal ruled, quote, "To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole." Meaning that the aggressor is responsible for everything done as a result. The Allies had firebombed and nuked civilians, and they didn't even have much of a pretense of discrimination in doing so. The deaths and suffering that resulted would have been probably the greatest evil of the century if they hadn't been overshadowed by the greater evils perpetrated by their enemy. So aggression was not to be the only crime that Germany's leaders would be prosecuted at Nuremberg, but other crimes were deliberately framed as being subsidiary to it. US Chief Justice Robert Jackson explained at the planning stage that, quote, "It has been a general principle from time immemorial that the internal affairs of another government are not ordinarily our business, and that, quote, it is justifiable that we interfere or attempt to bring retribution to individuals or to states only because the concentration camps and deportations were in pursuance of a common plan or enterprise in making an unjust war." So he's saying that the only reason that they can try crimes against humanity is because there's a crime of aggression. At Nuremberg, they immunized high-level Allied commanders. That did not mean that Allied personnel could not be prosecuted for war crimes by their own side, but there would not be and could not be an international effort to prosecute the victims of aggression or those exercising collective self-defense against an aggressor. Obviously, one can see the potential flaws in this system, but none of those flaws compared to the obscenity of using international law as a way of constraining or punishing those who are victims of aggression. If the aggressors care to protect their own civilians, they need to end their aggression or occupation. If they do not do so, they are the prime culprits. That is the logic of this legal framework. The New Zealand government cares neither for legality nor for human suffering. At the time of their statement, there was already a 200-to-1 ratio of Iranian civilian deaths versus those caused by Iran. They have chosen, like the lapdogs that they are, to blame the victims, to attack the weak, and to give cover for the fascist mass murderers. That's why I bring the legality into play, not because I'm a great fan of international law, but because it's a framework. And the framework makes it very clear that we have no moral standing to condemn Iran while it's under attack. And it doesn't mean we love the Iranian regime. The nature of the Iranian regime is not even relevant in this circumstance. There is no legal defence for this war in any way. It is outright aggression. Anyway, this is all I wanted to say on the subject, and I hope you've been enlightened by this, and I will talk to you again soon. Thank you for watching. Ka kite.